Partnerships and relationships are
You can see that line.
I just wanted to kind of kick off tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm talking tonight about the role that design thinking might play in helping spur social innovation. While I promised not to spend too long on definitions, I did feel that it was probably worthwhile to offer some working definitions to help, I suppose, frame tonight's discussion. Really what design thinking is about is the application of design methods and skills, so the skills that we've developed as designers and I would say artists as well in the context of tonight's discussion, particularly from industrial and interaction design, but also other design fields like architecture in terms of patterns and things like that. And applying them in very different contexts to the traditional design fields. Commonly it's seen as being a new way of working for business strategy, but also for government policy. But what does it mean in practice is kind of the question that comes up for me when I first heard about design thinking. What does it mean specifically for social innovation and sustainability? And this is one of the questions that when I started, I'm currently studying my Masters at RMIT, and when I first started I really wanted to kind of delve a bit deeper into what design thinking might have to offer in the sustainability space. And so I kind of, my first semester was putting together a bit of a report that was a little bit of a literature review. It's not a traditional literature review, delving into some of the concepts. If you Google design thinking and sustainability, the report will come up. It's fairly long, it's reasonably academic. And the first thing that kind of comes up with design thinking is to empathise with the people that we're actually wanting to serve and to work with. To take their perspective in the work that we do in terms of encouraging social innovation and the work that we're doing, which is a principle that really comes from that interaction design and other design disciplines. And it's often referred to as human-centred design, so placing the people that we're actually working with at the centre of our process. Design thinking encourages to take that deeper understanding, and as well as the practical aspects of the product and service, so it's really looking at both of those aspects. The second kind of principle is the idea of zooming out for context. For example, if we're looking at a new experience related to a car, for example, we'd look at mobility and not just cars. Again, I'm suspecting that's a principle that a lot of you are kind of familiar with. One particular example that I would consider as a borderline social innovation, you'll see why I say borderline a little bit later, is something like a better place. So a better place kind of looks at the fact that electric cars are one potential way that we can actually radically reduce emissions through transport. What they did though is rather than just focus on the cars, they actually looked at the ecosystem surrounding mobility and surrounding what happens. So rather than thinking about we've got an electric car that we charge, they actually said, well, if we could actually replace the battery, that would be a lot quicker, and it mimics the current practice of dropping into a service station. So it was a different way of looking at a specific problem rather than just looking at the car but looking at the ecosystem around it. Important to achieving both of those objectives is research. One local example of that being used in a sustainability context is the Neighbourhood Scoreboard project. So Martin Tomic and the team at University of Sydney actually wanted to see, you've probably all heard about the idea of energy monitors and things like that and how it might change behaviour towards people actually reducing their energy consumption. They were working in the urban environment sphere and wanted to see how public displays of that information might influence behaviour differently to an in-home display, which is the more common use of that tool. Another point is the idea of collaboration. And when I was looking at collaboration, it kind of fell out into three different kind of key areas. It can mean within teams, so a team that's working on a particular project or within a particular organisation, but also importantly, it's about encouraging and involving the people that we aim to serve in the process of design. And that first term, co-design, is very much targeted at that particular type of process. It stands roughly for collaborative design. And it's activities where people collaboratively generate a new design. So rather than an individual working on something and coming up with it and then testing it with the market, it's actually about going to the market and working with them to actually develop new ideas. Another example is multidisciplinary teams, where people with different domain experience and perspectives are brought together to actually enrich the process of design, so we can look at things from different angles and really understand those from different perspectives. CoOppetition is the third one. It's probably less relevant for tonight's discussion, but it's really looking at where traditional competitors work together to achieve a common goal. The cooperation and collaboration approach to design, I think, is reflective in where we do our work. But basically, a lot of our work, and I would estimate, and this isn't a scientific estimation, that about 80% of our work is actually those top two pillars, and that about 20% of our work is the synthesis of that into actual products. What's interestingly is we get asked to do the synthesis, but the value of that process means that most of our work actually ends up in those top areas. And I think that's reflecting a changing role of the designer in the process, particularly in terms of social innovation, moving away from the idea of the genius designer, which I think Steve Jobs is often held up as an example of, Jonathan Ive, of course, being a key component of that team, towards the idea of becoming a role of a facilitator and guide through the process of design. The last point around design thinking is the idea of iteration. Iterative management comes from, there are a lot of different sources from this. Lean manufacturing has a part to play. In software and technology fields, it's called agile management. This is just a diagram that we use to describe to our clients the idea of how we manage an agile project using the Scrum methodology. One of the things that iterative development uses is prototyping. And Dave Gravina from Digital Eskimo calls this thinking with your hands, and I think it's a wonderful kind of a way of expressing it. The idea is that in execution we learn a lot. In doing something we learn a lot. And even the best designers can't think of everything. So you do the smallest possible that you can do to learn from that process, and then you learn, and then you do a little bit more, and then you do a little bit more, and you continue to test that as you go. Turning our attention now to social innovation, it's interesting, I'm just literally doing a project at the moment where I'm looking at some definitions of social innovation, and this one I thought was quite good. An innovation is social if the implied new idea has the potential to improve either the quality or the quantity of life. And it's an interesting way of looking at it. Innovations of that mould can come from business, they can come from government, they can come from an individual. It doesn't matter where it comes from. A lot of talk about innovation has been around the business community, so it's an interesting way to look at things. One of the things about social innovation, though, is that true social innovations can at first seem very foreign and very hard to make sense of, like this intriguing sculpture. Social innovations are new and daunting. They're often very hard to explain. There are limited examples, and therefore they're very hard for people to imagine what they might look like and how they might work. And I think that the designers and artists can play a key role in helping create a shared vision and comprehensible vision of these concepts that are quite hard to grasp. The examples from Smart Design, which is a design firm out of the States, and this was in response to that Fast Company Biomimicry Challenge I mentioned earlier. There is sound to the video if you find it online. It talks through how ambient feedback mechanisms related to water usage might manifest in an urban environment. So the idea is that we're in an urban environment, we're quite disconnected from our environment. It's all concrete and a concrete jungle. So how can we actually bring in to that environment really interesting ways of reconnecting with our water usage so that we know that when that little plant bed in the street is starting to wilt, that we're using too much water. If you're doing work in this space, and I was talking to Mickey just earlier about taxis work and the fact that they document what they do really, really beautifully so that other people can learn from it. One of the things that I'd really strongly advocate if you're doing work within social innovation and you're doing work creatively, to consider using Creative Commons licenses to make that information available to a broader range of people. It really encourages and enables sharing, but also to get involved with local groups like Social Innovation Sydney, who are bringing together like-minded people to address these challenges from all sorts of different backgrounds, or Open IDEO, which is very much more focused on bringing the design community specifically together around these challenges. And just on that last point, IDEO have actually done a really beautiful job of documenting a lot of these ideas and concepts in a book called Human-Centered Design, which is available for free for download. And while it's focused on human-centered design specifically, the examples that they use are very socially oriented. So even though it's not directly focused on that, I think it's a great starting point for if you wanted to explore these concepts further. So thank you.